Thank you guys so much. I got to shake some hands this morning, and I'm glad everyone's in good spirits and happy to have you all here. You're right. The census is one of the most impactful civic responsibilities that all of us share. And so as a partnership specialist with the census, I typically go around and have an opportunity to work within communities to discuss some of those things that were actually on your PowerPoint, how the census impacts us, what the census is, and really just the general overview of our operations and other things so they know what to expect. Forgive me for moving your, okay. I'm gonna start off with what is the census, and I know we kind of briefly did an overview up here, but I'm always amazed when I go around and speak to different organizations, even elected officials, that many don't understand what the census is and why we have to do it. And that may be because we do so many different types of, we have so many different types of census operations, from housing surveys and different other surveys that we do throughout the year, economic surveys. So when you come to the census, they're thinking, oh brother, another thing that we're forced to do, right? So I often have to explain why we take the census and how it impacts our lives. The census is a constitutional mandate, and since 1790, the U.S. Census Bureau has conducted a census every 10 years to count every single person living in the United States. And that's not just citizens, right? That's every single person that lives within the United States and its territories, and we do that primarily because for apportionment and redistricting, but also because we have to know how to plan. So we take the census because it's a constitutional mandate, right? There's nothing more important than making sure that we're able to allocate the congressional districts fairly and proportionately amongst the states. We were lucky last time. Texas gained 4 congressional seats, and we're expected to possibly gain another 3 after the 2020 census if we have a complete and accurate count, which means that some states lost congressional representatives. New York lost congressional representatives, and some other states as well. So what does that mean? They're going to be fighting tooth and nail to get them back, because congressional representatives equal power. It equals a say. It equals more unity in how we push our legislative agenda state by state by state. And so having those extra voices means something, and they're going to be fighting to get those representatives back. In addition, we take the census because of, can someone yell out a really important reason why we do the census? Money. I heard money. We'll get to that one, but money. I don't know if you guys remember the number last time. It was about $400 billion distributed annually to the states every year for 10 years. Now we're talking about $650 billion allocated to the states every year for the next 10 years. What that means for Texas, I think there was a George Washington University put together Accounting for Dollars, which basically explains how census data is used, and I believe we made a copy of that for everyone here. And they estimate that for every person not counted in Texas, it's a loss of $1,574 per person per year for the next 10 years. Now think about, what, 21 million people in Texas. 1% is really substantial, and that means a loss of money for Title I programs, a loss of money for SNAP benefits, a loss of money for housing vouchers. It's extraordinary the many ways that we use census data for every program that we have across the country. So it's money, but finally it's also planning. We need to know where to build those new schools, right? And businesses need to know where to set up shop. And they do so based on census data. Texas is very diverse. Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the country. And many people rely on that data to know, where am I going to build or place my next business? It's important. And we need to know where to build those bridges and roads and parks and all those other things. So money, power, and data planning. That's how we use census data, and so it's important to every person living here, and we hope that we can get that message out. We saw the questionnaire, and I just want to quickly address the citizenship question because it is the elephant in the room, and since it was mentioned in the PowerPoint, it said that I think they are pushing that question, and I want to be very clear, the administration is pushing that question, not the Census Bureau. Because, and the reason I say that is, we on the ground in partnership understand the devastating effect that asking that question could have in communities. We already have enormous fear, not just in immigrant communities, even though that's very substantial in and of itself, but we have fear from other populations as well. And asking that one question could hinder our ability to get a response, not just from those who are undocumented, but from those who are documented as well. And the whole purpose of the census is to make sure we have a complete and accurate count. It's not about politics. It's not about what our personal views are on how people come or whether they should stay. The Census Bureau does not get caught up in those kinds of issues. We do a count, very simply. And so we do want it to be accurate, and we know that we get the most accurate results when people can self-respond. That means not waiting until an enumerator comes knocking on their door, right? We want them to be able to fill out their census questionnaire, the one that she showed up above, and do it completely and accurately. Having said that, we hope to make, yes, ma'am?
So can we ask questions now? No, we're going to have a Q&A. I'll write it down.
Thank you. And I'll look forward to your question. But having said that, now we're trying to make it a little easier for people to self-respond. There are going to be 3 ways, and not just that paper questionnaire that we've all become accustomed to. Finally, the United States government is getting with the times. Woohoo! That means we'll have an online option. You'll be able to call in and get assistance filling it out by phone. They'll take the data by phone. In years past, we had assistance centers where you can call in, but they only help you fill out your questionnaire, and then you were supposed to mail it back, right? So this year, you'll be able to call and provide the information by phone. Now, what will happen is, in the beginning of March, every single person will get a postcard with an ID number on it, saying, as of March 23rd, on March 23rd, you can begin filling out your census questionnaire online using your ID number. The ID number links to an address, so even if you lose the ID number, you can still go online and enter your address and complete the questionnaire. What we try to stress, many people fill out the questionnaire, but there's still an undercount. Some people forget children. You said that's one of the most undercounted groups, and she is absolutely right. Children under 5 seem to be left off that questionnaire, and particularly children under 1. So we need to make sure that everyone is completely and accurately filling it out for every single person living in their household, and that doesn't just mean relatives. So the person at the top fills out the questionnaire, or the head of the household, and fills it out for even if there's unrelated renters in your home, or just you took someone in, then they need to be counted as well, right? So as of March 23rd, you can do that online. If you fail to do that after several attempts, you will get a packet with a paper questionnaire, and you'll have an opportunity to send that back. But should that not occur, then we do start non-response follow-up in May, and that means we have to send enumerators out to knock on doors. We know when we get to that point, it's very difficult and it's very expensive. It costs us a lot of money, and typically people who are in non-response are either fearful or they're so busy with their lives. Many single mothers or single fathers who have to work 2 jobs just don't have time to fill out that census questionnaire. So we ask our partners, and we tend to go around and start different initiatives like census in schools, because if children are educated about the census, sometimes they go home and fill it out for their parents, or they encourage their parents to fill it out. So when we teach them the value of filling out the census, they feed that information back home, and they typically handle it that way, and that's a good thing for us. Students who were on the college campus, and they're a big undercounted population. We think it's because they're at that age where they're learning civic responsibility. They'll go vote, right? But then they still want their parents to fill out their taxes, and they still call mommy and daddy to handle all their other government forms. So the census is one of those forms that they think mom and dad are just going to take care of. No, students need to be counted where they are as of April 1st, 2020. So if that's living on campus or living in off-campus housing, they need to fill out their own census questionnaire. Mom and dad does not include them, right? We also have the issue of single parent families sharing custody, and we get that question a lot. Who claims the child, right? If it's 50-50 custody, then the person with the child on April 1st, 2020 is the one who writes that child on the census form. All these things we go around as partnership and explain, and we'll be happy to come to your individual group and do a full presentation on it. But let's talk about some of the things you can do now to prepare for the census. Two things. One, we'll be opening our area census offices really soon. The Regional Census Center in Dallas is opening May 1st, and that means a lot of jobs. About 170 professional positions, many of those positions paying $160,000 a year for the next 2.5 years. IT specialists paying between 80 and 120, I believe. Managers paying 60 to 100 and some odd thousand. So there are a lot of professional positions, and we'll be opening an office here in Houston as we're an area census office, and that means jobs for our community. Many don't know about census jobs until 2020, and by then we only have the enumerator jobs, and they pay well as well, $25 an hour, but we want our community to apply for these high-paying professional positions as well. So I would say look to census.gov. It's going to be on the About Us page. You'll see our region, which is the Denver Regional Census Office, right? And jobs. Keep looking from June 1st onward. They'll be posting jobs, and I really want to stress that, because when people are invested in the census in different ways, they're more apt to participate, and it benefits their families. Also, we're creating complete count committees with governments and communities. Tell me how I'm doing with time. Okay. We're creating complete count committees with governments and community groups right now, and we have Councilwoman Bonner here from Lufkin. There was the first CCC training in the nation, and that occurred 2 weeks ago, and then we just had one in Dallas. So when your partnership specialist, Rebecca Briscoe, comes back from maternity leave, trust me, she'll be all over you guys to start doing your complete count committees. We'll start with the cities, and basically a complete count pulls together trusted voices from many different sectors of the community. You'll have those representing business, those representing media, different ethnic organizations, immigrant groups, veterans, homeless. We want them all faith-based. That's a big one in schools. We want to pull them all together so that we have those trusted voices telling the community that it's safe and that it's okay to fill out the census. And on the safety issue, two things. Many people in the community don't trust their data because they think it's going to be hacked. That's a big issue now. While we have never experienced a hack, we are definitely on it. The Department of Commerce is around the clock working to protect the information, and we have many different layers of security that have been implemented. We have never been breached before. The government, maybe other contractors' information has gotten out, but the Census Bureau data has never been breached, and we hope that remains the case. Many people are also scared that their information will be shared with other federal entities, immigrant groups, or people living in apartment complexes who should only have 2 or 3 people staying with them, and they actually have 7. They think we're going to share that with their landlord or their, the apartment complex. People who have committed crimes. Just many different entities are frightened about how we share the data, and we don't. We're not allowed to. Your information is protected by federal law, and should I reveal even a name, I could go to jail for 5 years and be subject to a $250,000 fine. The president cannot even call me and say, Deon, I need a name. I cannot give it. In fact, for all the 3 decades that I've worked with the Census Bureau, I've never been asked, and I don't even have access. I've never even looked up my own personal record to see where I live and who was on my census form. So we want everyone to know that it's safe and secure, and we cannot breach confidentiality. back to what the community can do. After we establish the government CCCs, we will work with community groups and nonprofits to set up community CCCs, complete counts. We do that because we have large pockets of hard-to-count populations. If you go to census.gov/ROAM, R-O-A-M, R-O-A-M, you'll see a map, which I kind of passed out, which shows your city, and it shows all the pockets of high, low response areas, meaning areas with a 30 to 50% chance of not responding to the census in 2020. There's other areas in there. You see the lighter blue, and they may have, what, a 15 or 20% chance of not responding, but you'll get an idea of where communities should focus their efforts. In 2010, we had enormous resources, unlimited dollars from stimulus funding. You guys remember that? We were everywhere. We had swag up the Yahoo. We were handing out caps and T-shirts and posters. We won't have that money this time. We won't have money to give to community groups. We won't have money to bring that kind of merchandise to events. So the Complete Count Committee is going to be essential, and we want you to tailor it to the data. We don't need to be everywhere, all over the place like we were in 2010, going to every event. What we need to do is look at the map and say, where are these harder or higher low response areas, and tailor our initiatives. When you click on the map, you'll see why they're harder to count. It'll give you some ideas like the number of renters, the number of children younger than 5, the number of single-parent households, the number of people who don't speak English very well. All those factors contribute to a high-low response area, and you can tailor your CCC to address that. Okay, finally, just want to let you know that in addition to the area census offices, we do have a special enumeration. On that point, when we hit the college campuses, because kids typically leave school around May, we're going to start non-response earlier for them to make sure we catch them. Usually we start mid-May, but by then the students are gone. So we will be on the college campus knocking on housing to try to get the students before they leave school. And we also have an initiative for the homeless. And we have group quarters. All of those things will be on a timeline. So as we proceed, we'll go step by step and try to target all those populations and make sure we have a complete and accurate count. You let me know if we take questions now or after all the speakers.
Yeah, we're going to wait till after all the speakers.
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to present today. Sure.
Thank you again, Ms. Dionne Roberts. Now I would like to welcome Mr. Jeff Reichman.
Good morning, everybody. I don't have any slides, but I do have a few notes and a few things that I'm excited to talk to you about. I'm a data nerd. Are there other data nerds here? People? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's the census, right? It brings out all the data nerds. So that's why I'm here. I'm really interested in the census and what it means. I do 3 things. I run a consulting firm called January Advisors. We're a data science firm. You'll hear from my business partner, Neeraj, in a little bit. We also co-organize a community group called Sketch City, which is an open community of people who are interested in technology, data, and policy, and where that intersection comes together. So it's people who participate in hackathons, people who meet up on hack nights, and share information with one another. And I'm also a trustee and board member of the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit designed to get out the vote and for voter education. So it's through those last 2 capacities, through the League of Women Voters and Sketch City, that I'm going to talk to you today about a few things that we're planning for Census 2020 and offer an open invite to you all to join us, both with your organizations as citizens. So I wanted to underscore what Ms. Dionne was talking about the importance of a complete count. I work with census data for a living, and it matters. It really, really matters. When we file for disaster funding after Hurricane Harvey, we're using census data to figure out what happened, who was damaged. When they're allocating FEMA dollars for certain programs to rehabilitate housing, they want to prioritize based on low to moderate income areas. And that comes in large part from census data. So there are data analysts at every level of government who are using this information to better improve our neighborhoods and to better allocate funding to the people who need it the most. I also wanted to underscore what Ms. Dion was talking about with online response. This is the first time that the census is going to have a full online response. It's been done with the community surveys in interim years before, but they expect 55% of people to respond online. That's a lot of people responding online, and that prompts almost a digital literacy crisis. It means that people need to know that it's safe. They need to know how to get online. They need to know where they can get online and have help to fill it out. So Sketch City and the League of Women Voters are both convening organizations. With Sketch City, we convene technology people. With the League of Women Voters, we convene citizens. And together, we want to focus on providing community organizations with the skills, resources, and volunteers to assist them with their outreach in Census 2020. So if you are working with a community organization, whether it's an ethnic-based organization, whether it's a neighborhood-based organization, Sketch City and the League of Women Voters are there to help you with the types of volunteers that you need to get your job done. Some of these areas include digital marketing. So there's going to be social media campaigns. There's going to be neighborhood-based campaigns. There's going to be ways in which you're going to reach out to different people. Census messaging, so messaging to different identities within Houston. The Vietnamese community might be different than the Ismaili community. Digital literacy and training. How do we make sure that everybody understands what the census is and what online response means? With partnership development, so if you're looking to host workshops, if you're looking to convene people through your organizations, we can help with the partners that we have. And through technology program design. So really thinking about how do you integrate technology into your messaging. We're planning several workshops over the next few months, and we want to invite you to participate. These workshops are very interactive. We break into tables, and we focus on marketing on this table, and we focus on data visualization in that table. So if you're interested in learning about these disciplines, even if you're not an expert, it's a great way to learn. And newbies are welcome. And when you have expertise in a particular area, whether it's fundraising or marketing or you name it, that's when you can share your knowledge. So I invite you to participate and partner with us. If you're sitting here going, what is this guy talking about? And you're just looking for a next step, we're hosting the City of Houston Hackathon with the City of Houston in May. We have a Census 2020 track where we're going to make available all sorts of census data from 2010 through 2016. And we're going to have trainings on how to manipulate that data and use that data. We're going to be looking at certain highlights from it and exploring our city through maps. So it's going to be a great way early on to really get familiar with what kind of census data exists and why it's so important that we collect it. So again, my name is Jeff Reichman. That's all I have. I'm sorry I don't have slides, but I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so next we have Mr. Niraj Tandon. Please welcome Mr. Tandon.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. Let me see if I can pull this up. All right. Okay, so brief introduction, although Jeff kind of already introduced me by proxy. So I'm principal at January Advisors. I work on a lot of projects concerning data. We use, as Jeff mentioned, the census data in almost every project. Types of projects we work on are generally with nonprofits, and they're generally focused on advocacy, right? That's kind of a common thread in all of our projects. And in order to advocate, you need to know who you're advocating for, and you need to know where they are and how many they are and things like that. But there's another thing. I can actually throw another ounce of weight behind the massive importance of the census with a personal story about a nonprofit that I co-founded a few years ago called Code Park. We teach kids technology and coding skills, and we want to focus on making sure that everyone in Greater Houston area has had a good, positive experience with technology, at least one. So we focus on underserved communities because a lot of the other communities have more resources and they've already got good classes. So how do we find the kids in our target audience? Well, the mayor, I don't know if you mentioned complete communities, but the mayor has kind of defined there's some complete communities in Houston. You can go to the city government website and it'll have a page about the complete communities. One of them is the 2nd Ward, which we've spent a lot of time in. Another is the near North Side neighborhood, which we've spent a lot of time in. But we want to grow. We want to serve more kids in Houston. And so if we want to start looking at acre homes, we want to know how many kids are there, how many classes are we going to have, how many teachers we need, how many computers, things like that. And we may go to, there is Booker T. Washington High School there, there's Williams Middle School there. We may go there and ask some kids, hey, what do you think about technology? Or what do you think about a career in technology? Or we're going to sample from that population. How do I move this thing? Do I use this? Okay. This is what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to sample. So we're not going to ask every single kid. We don't even know how many kids there are there. So we're not going to ask every single kid. We're going to stand there maybe for an afternoon and ask a certain number of kids in the middle school and a certain number of kids in the high school this question, and maybe we come up with a number. 40% of kids say they want to do technology in their life but don't have resources to do it or don't know where they find the classes to do it. That's great. We want that number. But we can't plan teachers around the number 40%. A percent doesn't work for us. We need to know how many kids so we know actually how many teachers to recruit. We can't recruit 40% teachers. We need a number. So what we do is we'll go and find out how many people ages 5 to 17 live in acre homes. And where we go for that is the census. And we're going to multiply 40% times 5,000 because that's what the census says. And then we're going to figure out, okay, we need 2,000. We have 2,000 kids. We need to have this many classes and that. And so we use this data all the time, and everyone uses this data. If you want to know how many people live in a place, you're looking at the census. And so I just wanted to add that because that's another reason why the census is so massively important, is because people just plan and base so many assumptions and decisions based off that. So what I talked about just now was common methodology. You use sampling in a lot of research. I have a background also in neuroscience and psychiatric research, and in that area too, we're not asking every single patient with schizophrenia in the whole country the same questions. We're not giving all of them MRIs. That would be insanely expensive. Sorry to use the word insanely. In that context, that's not that wasn't the right choice of words. That would be very expensive to do. And so what we do is we give a sample, maybe 100 or 200 people, MRIs. We take a look at their brains and see what's different between maybe another 100 or 200 healthy people. And then we make some differences. We measure the differences, and then we make some extrapolations based on the number of people with schizophrenia and the number of healthy people. And we say this many people have this much of a difference in this particular part of the brain. That number is based off of two things. One, it's based off a sample, and two, it's based off of this denominator, this multiplier that you're going to use to say, well, this many people. That's the census data still, right? I think this is extremely important. Now, how we find those people to sample from, earlier when I cited the Code Park example, the nonprofit example, I said I'm going to go to Booker T. Washington High School and Williams Middle School. That's what's called a sampling frame. That's how I know where I find the kids. But if I were to make an assumption about acre homes based off those two schools, I'd be missing some kids. Because some of the kids didn't go. Mayor Sylvester Turner grew up in acre homes. He didn't go to Booker T. Washington High School. He went to a different high school, which there's like a small edge of another school district that comes into acre homes. So I can't actually make that assumption about acre homes correctly. I'm going to be inaccurate rather. And so that's where the sampling frame comes in. So how is all this stuff used in the census? Well, it starts with knowing where the homes are. So there's actually two stages to the census. First, you need to know how many homes there are, how many places people live. Then you send the postcards to those places so that you get the sampling frame, which is where the homes are. Then you send the postcards, and then you get how many people there are. So the sampling frame is extremely important. So it's extremely important to know where people are living. And after Hurricane Harvey, it's become even more of a pressing challenge to figure out where have people relocated to. There's also another use for this type of methodology, which is the American Community Survey and intercental estimates. So basically, you know, we get a 2010 estimate, and we wait until 2020 to get the other 2010 count, hard count, and then we wait until 2020 to get another hard count. So what we do is we say, well, let's sample and see how much each place has grown, and then we'll take that 2020 thing and then just multiply it up to say how many people in 2016, 2017, 2018. So the sampling and the sampling frame is used to modify our census count. This is a picture of the 5th Ward, which is where we spent some time. I think I just wanted to have some color in the slide deck. I already talked about this. So there's some challenges with sampling frames. This is, I nabbed this from Wikipedia, but I thought this is actually really well, it gives us some nice food for thought and for discussion later. So these are the 4 challenges that can arise. So one is missing elements. This is a big thing. We talk about the undercount of in the census. Some of the members of the population not included, meaning what I described with acre homes. If I just don't even go to that other high school to ask kids there, I'll miss that section of the population. Foreign elements and duplicate entries, these would probably be overcounts. In the census, in the Constitution, we talk about every living person. Every living person. So the foreign elements thing is not a concern here, although some people may be concerned about that. That's not actually part of this particular problem set. The duplicate entries, though, is, and that's a challenge. It's really hard. If the divorced parents both count that child, then what do we do? How do we reconcile that? And then the groups or clusters is another thing. So if we get a household, and we just have that counted once as a group instead of as each individual living person in that household, then we may end up with an undercount situation again. Okay, so I'll pause for a second and tell you a little bit about the census. I have a lot of admiration for the Census Bureau. They do some amazing work. It's extremely challenging, and they are data nerds through and through. They also are extremely professional and take a lot of accountability, a lot of efforts to be accountable for what they do after every census. There's a lot of money spent, a lot of taxpayer money spent, a lot of man hours spent, and there are efforts made to make large, introspective reports. I want to share a few of those with you this afternoon, because I think these are things that we should all go back and read more, so that we can learn lessons from previous census efforts. The first one is the Community Challenges Report. I think this one's really important and really interesting. This one is basically a survey where you ask about people's opinions or thoughts about the census, and you try to gauge, well, what's the likelihood that people in this particular community are going to respond based on their attitudes about the survey, about the census. And then the integrated plan for communications. This is what we were talking about. You know, there's the partnership program and a bunch of other programs. It's all part of an integrated plan. There's a prime contractor that gets hired by the federal government, and that contractor then just goes and comes up with this massive plan to cover the whole country, and works very closely with the Bureau. And they issue a report that talks about strategies from the very high level down to the nitty-gritty, and specific demographic strategies and specific geographic strategies are included in that report. And then this is another really interesting, fascinating one to me as a data nerd, is the CCM, the census coverage measurement. So this is after the census is done, the census goes back and checks its work. And this is how it says, we think we overcounted here, we think we undercounted here, which itself is, it's really interesting and cool to think about that level of accountability and introspection. I think it's also very instructive for the next census that's coming up. So the CBAMs, the acronym there, just to expand it, it's Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators. This is a survey targeted to gauging attitudes about the census. And I highlighted a few things here from it. The likelihood to participate, barriers to participation, and to kind of go back to what Jeff was saying about digital literacy, internet use and skills are all being asked about. Along with a handful of other things, including attitudes about the federal government, trust, and things like that. Here's some sample questions that'll get to it. So these are actually from the 2020 proposed questionnaire. How much of the time do you think you can trust your federal government to do what is right? They also ask about the state government. They also ask about the local government separately. About confidentiality, as Robbins mentioned, and how easy do you think it'll be for you to complete it? And a lot of people are just like, oh my gosh, it's a long form, I hate forms, I don't want to do it. And so you want to gauge all of that, and all of these are on scale, so there's a quantitative component to it. So you're going to say, you know, all the time, none of the time, those type of scales. I'm sure we've all taken those type of surveys. So you get some quantitative data. And the last one, the census, actually the contractor, Draft FCB, created segments. So they did some clustering on the responses and created segments, like types of people. And they named them these funny names, like leading edge and head nodders and the unacquainted and cynical fifth. And you know, they had these profiles, and they were trying to come up with marketing strategies for each of these. And I thought it was really interesting. I'm going to be interested to see if the contractor this time comes up with similar stuff. I don't know how useful this was, but I thought it was kind of funny. Back in 1990, they did something like the CBAMs. Some researchers went and took out some data. And I think it's interesting to think about how things have changed since 1990. So, you know, the safety concerns for enumerators, I think, are always, you know, we think about the safety for people opening their doors to the enumerators. There were times in certain cities where there was a lot of fear about crime. Murder rates were very high, things like that, and the enumerators were like, I don't want to go there. I'm just going to check off these things, and I'm going to get out of here. So, you know, there was actually a higher probability of an overcount when there were high crime areas, which was interesting. And then areas with high number of children, actually, they said they were more likely to be counted back then, because parents were more, you know, oh, I know where my kids are, and they counted them. But here, actually, it's no longer the case. Kids are not counted, as we know, as we've heard earlier. The Census Integrated Communications Plan, the contractor this time was selected as Young and Rubicon. I'm sure they have their own website where they talk about the work they're doing. I've actually put some links. I can share this, maybe this PowerPoint. There are a bunch of links to all the actual reports, so you don't have to go dig them up on your own. But as of 2017, I pulled some data out of this because I thought this was interesting. The smartphone, the number of people who own a smartphone. So are you going to be able to respond on the phone? Will you have to have a laptop? If a lot of people own phones now, how do we actually make sure that it's accessible by the phone? And in teaching kids to code, I've realized that a lot of kids can't type like this. They struggle. They're like this. But if you give them a phone, they're just, boom, they're just going. They're like off to the races. They can type with their thumbs, but not with all their full fingers. So, you know, sometimes digital literacy is actually more shifted towards mobile devices now. And so that's something to consider. There's a lot of other very interesting information in there. They also pulled some of this stuff together. I pulled this one from, they have, you know, segments of demographics. So I pulled this one from the African American segment. And I'm going to share with you some highlights here. So I thought this one struck me, and I was like, why? More likely that less socially conscious African Americans will respond more readily. That less socially conscious. I don't know where they came up with this, but I think it has something to do with this one. There's high distrust of government as a result of historic and consistent disenfranchisement. So this is the level of insight that they're trying to get, and I don't know what the strategies are that they can build on top of this insight, but I think that's something that we all can try to help them with, and try to help them actually wrangle with in our discussions as they continue to evolve, and as we interact and talk to our communities and ask the hard questions from the census about trust issues. I just put another map in here because I thought it was cool. This is from the census. And then I'm going to close soon with this one. Am I okay on time? Okay. I'm going to close soon, but I wanted to talk about this one. This one I'm really interested in, and it gets a little more technical, so I apologize if there's some math. There's the CCM report from the last census, coverage measurement. So this is where the census goes and says, okay, how well did we do? How well did we do on the count in every single place that we counted? I told you there might be some math. This is just this is a simple percentage calculation, right? So they come up with this thing called the DSE, the dual system estimate, which I'll describe a little more in a second. and they say, okay, get the DSE, the estimate, and then subtract the census count, and then divide that by the DSE, multiply by 100, you just get a percent. You get a percent of the undercount. And you may have a negative percent if you overcounted. So what's this DSE thing? So what the DSE kind of ties back to the sampling frame idea I described to you. So the dual system estimate is used a lot actually in counting wildlife populations. So what you do is you say, I'm going to count two different ways. I'm going to have some trackers on a few animals, and then I'm going to also, see how many droppings I see in this one area that they pass through or something, right? You're not going to do that with humans, please. That'd be weird. But you do this with animals. The idea is that you count two different ways, right? You count two different ways, and then you compare the two, and you're like, how many did I count here? How many did I count here? And how many were the same? And how many were different? And then I use that to generate an estimate. That's the basic idea. And so the census does that using a lot of the information that you might expect. So things like tax revenue from different places, things like sales, things like property ownership, all of these different things, cars, all these different things that you may have some data for. This is the type of data that Jeff and I work with all the time. We're like, okay, how many people are here? Well, let's get all the different data we can and then try to reconcile it all. So this is what the census does, and then they compare that to the actual census estimate that they came up with. So I think that all three of these reports are extremely interesting. There are a lot of other reports that come out. All these things have a lot of data, charts, graphs that you can bore through. But I think the main takeaway there is that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the last census, and understanding the methodology a little bit better will help us make a more accurate count. And I'm really looking forward to digging in more. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Tandon. Now we'll have Acting Dean Gary Bledsoe.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I want to commend all of you for being here, and want to thank the folks at Jordan Leland and my good friend, Interim Dean Michael Adams, for helping to coordinate this. I think this is extremely important. I don't know the level of sophistication of everyone in the audience, so I think what I'll do is, if it's okay, I will give a little bit of background to let everyone know where we are and the landscape. I think that's relevant to understand what we need to be looking at for this next round of redistricting. First of all, I think that we look at the history of Texas, and history has always been very negative, that African Americans and Latinos have both been disenfranchised historically in the state. We go back to 1927 with Nixon versus Herndon, when L.A. Nixon from the NAACP in El Paso raised an issue about not being able to vote, and was able to take that case to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was the first great victory, one of the first for the national NAACP, and with voting rights. But of course, in Texas, they wanted to let everyone know they will continue to resist. So we ultimately went to 1944 in Smith versus Allwright, a case that came right out of here that addressed the issue of African Americans being denied the opportunity to vote in the Democratic primary. And so there were still issues and impediments that continue to exist. If we take a look back at the country during that time period, we had proportional voting systems and systems like that all around the country. But I think it was decided or understood that the way to stop this this great increase of minority voting is to go to at-large voting. So at-large voting became a major issue, but in Texas we still had the poll tax until the 1960s. So we continue to have all of those issues. Now, what occurred in 1965, we know the Voting Rights Act was passed. Now, what did the Voting Rights Act do? It really implemented the 15th Amendment to try to guarantee some opportunity for minorities to be able to have some kind of representation in our governing bodies or in politics. And Texas was not immediately covered. It was later covered because of efforts that Barbara Jordan and members of the Latino community to get Texas covered. But now, one of the things I think that that's really significant, if we look at look at our state since 1965, every single round of redistricting, every single round, the state has been found guilty of discriminating against racial and/or ethnic minorities in terms of the redistricting. So that was true when Democrats were in power. That is true now with Republicans in power. So one of the things, and even in one of the cases in the 1990s, they talked about how a local senator here, who happened to be a Democrat, was drawing up a seat here to the expense of the Latino community. So that's actually in the Fifth Circuit opinion. So we have a history of being denied the right to vote. The next point, I think, to understand where we are is to look at what's occurring in our nation to truly understand the fight that we're having. And I think Texas is a real microcosm of the nation, so I think that's extremely important to note. In Texas, 49.4%, according to the 2010 census, and the numbers have actually increased since then, but I'll use those figures for the sake of our discussion. Traditionally, in redistricting, you look at population and adult voting age population to determine how many districts might be drawn up for which group or what have you. And so when you look at Texas, 49.4% of our adult voting age population was African American and Latino combined. So that's really half of the state. And when you add Asians and others, there was about 55% of the state. So you had a majority-minority state, and the state is continuing to become increasingly minority as we speak. Now, what's occurred in this area, in my opinion, it's occurred because of a desire to disenfranchise minorities, and in particular the Latino community. Now in this circuit, we're using citizen voting age population as a requirement. It's no longer just voting age population like it had traditionally been. It's citizen voting age population. When you look at those numbers, African Americans and Latinos are still 39.3% of the adult population in our state. Now, and we also, one point that we must make, and that is when you look at the younger people in this state, you look at the children of this state, it's far and away more minority than Anglo. So you can see the trend in this state. So when we understand that and understand our history, we understand that what's afoot here is keeping power. You just cut it to the chase. There's no other explanation. This is all about power. And what can we do to prevent minorities from taking over? Because we don't trust minorities to do the things that we want. So this is a fight. And so what's occurring at this point is just an incredible level of dishonesty that we find in the court system. And so the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 had a number of important provisions. I want to talk about three of them just briefly, and that is you have Section 2, which is the primary one that is used today, where if there's a voting practice that has the effect of discrimination or that is intended to discriminate, that violates those provisions. The other provision is Section 5. Section 5 was really significant for us, but when Section 4, portions of Section 4 were invalidated in a completely baseless opinion, in my opinion, by the United States Supreme Court, that made Section 5 a nullity, because it's there, but it applies to no one. And why do I say that about the Supreme Court opinion? I went up for the arguments in that case, and maybe the third time I'd heard Justice Scalia scream out that the Voting Rights Act was a racial entitlement. Highly offensive comment, and he said it twice during the arguments in that case. So he was clearly trying to send a signal and be provocative and antagonistic. And there's a real belief on the right that indeed it is a racial entitlement, which is absurd because of what it does provide. But in that case, the Voting Rights Act had to be extended, and we were really very much involved, the NAACP in Texas, and actually got an award from the Congressional Black Caucus for our efforts because we were able to, John Cornyn was blocking the bill, we took a whole group and did a sit-in at Senator Cornyn's office, and we were able to get him to change his vote because we'd done hearings all around the state, and we presented him the product of those hearings to let him know that indeed there are still all these irregularities that are occurring throughout our state. And so we were able to get that changed and get the law extended, because what normally is happening is that they extended for 25 years each time, and so when it was up for an extension, we were able to get extended. But in getting it extended, there were probably 20,000 pages of testimony and documents that were presented to the United States Congress, and so that justified which jurisdictions were still covered by the Voting Rights Act. And so all of our southern states were continually covered by the Voting Rights Act, and other jurisdictions where there had been a history of discrimination. And so there was a great database for that. And the Supreme Court said there was no justification for singling out these areas of the country. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts said in his opinion that that blacks in Mississippi had it better than blacks in Massachusetts. So I was highly offended by those kind of specious things that occur that have no basis in fact. And so the Supreme Court invalidated Section 5. So why did they invalidate Section 5? Section 5 made it very difficult for jurisdictions to continue their discrimination. What Section 5 did is when you had any kind of change in a voting practice and you were in a covered jurisdiction like we were in Texas, you had to go to the Department of Justice and you had to get them to look at it, examine it, open it up for comment, and allow people to protest or what have you the change. And so we did that quite a bit. And I must say, though, that when the 2001 round came around, they had people such as Hans von Spakovsky, who was noted for purging black voters in Florida, as the number 3 official in the Justice Department. We went up to lobby them about not approving the Texas redistricting plan, and we had objected to von Spakovsky being there, but all of their folks were there. And what became known later is that the career staff said that Texas plan was discriminatory, but the political staff okayed the change, and they wrote a very simple, like a one-page thing clearing it. So it was really unprecedented. There was no rationale, nothing. They just cleared the Texas law, and so we had that opportunity where we were able to stop many bad things from occurring. There were so many we couldn't catch all. But Texas led the nation. I want to say that again. Texas led the nation in really the objections under Section 5 because of all the activities and things that were occurring within our state. So what is the import of not having Section 5? Because Section 5 meant if you're going to change boundaries in your commissioner's precinct, if you're going to change boundaries for city councils, if you're going to change voting locations, if you're going to change your law about who's eligible to vote, if you're going to change your law about who election officials can be, all of those things had to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice under Section 5. So when in this specious opinion, in 2013, the Supreme Court eliminated that. in a 5-4 baseless opinion that put us in the situation of what we have to do now is go and file lawsuits each time we want to contest a practice. And this puts an onerous burden on all of us who want to see minorities to be able to participate in the government. One thing I want to note here is that because we don't have a Section 5. See, Section 5 said, you know, if you've got this level of representation, unless there's some unusual growth patterns or some justification, you need to continue with this level of representation. You can't have retrogression. You can't go backwards. But now we don't have that. And so when the cities and counties and even the state of Texas sit down to decide who is going to be our representative, that's not going to, we no longer have that floor. We've got to go and litigate those cases under Section 2. So one of the things we're going to need to do in that regard is to try to, and this is a thing I've been trying to work on with the National NAACP and National Bar Association, to try to get, to train up individual lawyers. So individual lawyers will have some of the background and capacity to file some of these suits, but also to join with the number of national organizations that bring these kinds of suits, because these suits, they're very complex, and the lawyers who do redistricting are really true experts. I'm a lawyer who does redistricting, so I'm not a redistricting expert, but I've done a good bit of redistricting litigation. But there's going to be an important thing to be able to do that. Now let me go into the infrastructure that what we need to do and what's required to be proven under the law in order to be able to get effective participation. This is how I would do it. In terms of redistricting, the question is, what would we be entitled to? I would still use what has occurred in the past. So if we've got one person or two persons on the county commissioner's court, that we should be able to continue with that number. But what I would do, and I know the law doesn't provide for this, and so I say this with a caution, but I think it's a good barometer for us to understand what we might be able to do. And so you take the eligible folks of voting age in a particular area, and you look at that population, the citizen voting age population in this circuit, and you determine that if you've got 5 persons on a body and you have this number of minorities, what number should that guarantee you? Okay? And so that's your internal operation. So if that means 1 person, if that means 2 persons, we don't know. If that means 3, you know, whatever it might be, you work from that. If you got 4 elected by district and 1 at large, you look at how many districts you have. So if you've got 4 county commissioners, for example, and 1 county judge, you look at proportionality, which is not guaranteed, again, under the law, but I think it's a good barometer to start with, so you understand how many individuals that might be that one might be entitled to. Now, what the law says is that we engage in these fictions, that you engage in these fictions about traditional redistricting principles and things like that when you draw up precinct lines. And one of the things they threw out in the 1990s that was intended to eliminate the possibility of getting more minority districts is they said you can't use race as the primary reason for drawing a district. Because one would think, well, minorities have been disenfranchised. We're trying to enforce the Voting Rights Act. So therefore, we ought to be able to use race and say we're trying to see how many districts. But you can't do that. So you have to say, you know, there's a community of interest, that there are common schools, that there are common tax bases, such as cities or what have you, that should be wholly contained, that there is a culture, there are complete neighborhoods. You have to drill down and match up people using those kinds of means, and hopefully the ultimate result will be an appropriate result. But you cannot say that I sat down and decided we were going to try to see about getting African American participation. You can include that as one of many criteria, but it's got to be subsumed in there in one just ordinary criterion. It can't be the primary thing or the main thing. So so when we do that, we have to look at being able to justify being able to do that. Now, we need to be able to draw up our own districts, and we need to be able to tender those districts so that our governing bodies can consider those districts. And so now, what's really kind of required to prove that we can have those districts? Well, one of the things that occurred with the extension of the Voting Rights Act back in I think it was 1990 or what have you, there was a compromise, and so the results test was allowed to go forward with the understanding that proportionality would not be a requirement. And so we have to look at and see whether or not minorities can elect a person of their choice if they have sufficient numbers, if minorities are sufficiently together, and if there is continued racially polarized voting. So those are the things that you need to look at in order to be able to prove under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that one might be entitled to a district. So what does that mean? That means that, for example, if you have minorities who don't vote, and so you may have the sufficient numbers, you may be able to say, look, there's a 65% district we've drawn there. But then when you go and look and see how that district is voted in various races, and minorities are not voting, and the minority candidate, and so minority candidates could not win because they're not voting, then that presents a problem. However, if minorities are voting and you can show that minority candidates would vote, for example, you might look at a gubernatorial election, you might look at a presidential election and see how those individuals vote to determine whether or not they are sufficiently involved to be able to vote and actually prevail. So that's the requirement, and that's a particular problem in some places around the state. You know, there are some places where minority groups have the numerosity, but because of cultural or whatever other reasons, the voting numbers are so low, it makes it really difficult. I know that African Americans have traditionally not had that problem. One of the things that was interesting in the redistricting litigation was that the expert that I put on the stand, Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston, testified that all you need is 30% African Americans, that you anywhere in the state, that which you put 30% African Americans in a district, they're going to win. On cross-examination, I got the state's expert, Dr. John Alford, to acknowledge that with 35%, an African American would win just about anywhere you have that the data shows that. So there has been some real engagement in the African American community with voting, and even the state's expert has acknowledged that. But we have to show that requirement, number one. Now, the number two is that folks vote together. So that even occurs within a community. If there's a schism in a community and folks don't vote together, then that's not going to work. But now, one of the things I want to talk about here, which I think is one of the more important issues that we're going to have to look forward to, is the idea of joining different groups together. The Fifth Circuit has said you can join groups together. There are 3 circuits that have said you can join groups together for the purposes of creating a group under the Voting Rights Act to create districts. There's 1 circuit, I believe, that has said you cannot do that. The United States Supreme Court has not decided that issue as yet. And we litigated that issue this last round of redistricting, and the NAACP and LULAC and other plaintiffs' parties took the position that you could join blacks and browns together. MALDEF and the state of Texas took the position that you could not do so. And so we were winning that issue until the very last decision. What occurred, we won in 2011. Supreme Court reversed us, said they used the wrong standard, and we retried the cases. We retried the 2011 maps in 2014, and we tried the 2013 maps in 2017, and the court issued opinions in the cases, and the Supreme Court has granted cert, and so we're going to hear, we did win those cases, and I can mention just briefly what was discussed regarding those. But they said about the idea of joining African Americans and Latinos together that it was really tough. They were leaning in our direction, but it just wasn't quite enough. And they looked at the information that MALDEF had put forward that the state embraced, that primarily out of Tarrant County, indicating some divisions in Tarrant County. So one of the things we're going to have to do is for minority groups is coordinate and work together. So there's no idea of there's a schism between African Americans and Latinos so that they can be joined together. Why do I say that? Why is that important? Because when you look at the districts around the state, you find, and if you have to use one group, we've pretty much maxed out if the 50.1% requirement is applied to individual groups. But if you want to get additional groups, additional representation, you're going to have to join, because what occurs is, for a number of reasons, African Americans and Latinos live in the same neighborhoods, are near each other, or what have you. And so you're going to have to be able to join those to get additional districts. Now, we're underrepresented. I just want to use the congressional part to let everyone know how underrepresented folks are. Before we went into the last round of redistricting, we had 32 congressional seats in Texas, and 12 of them were seats that either were dominated by the African American or Latino communities, or that they had great influence in. 20 of those were dominated by the white community, where they didn't have a voice. And so during the 10 years between the adoption of that old plan that was in effect in 2010, Texas had substantial growth that justified creating 4 new seats. And with those 4 new seats, you would think they would go to where the growth was. 79% of that growth was Latino growth. 14% of that growth was African American growth. For the first time in the history of Texas, African American growth actually exceeded, in pure numbers, not just percentage-wise, but in pure numbers, the African American growth exceeded Latino growth during that same time period. And so, what occurs? What does the legislature do? The legislature adopts Plan C-185, and C-185 gives us 10 seats. So it dropped from 12 to 10, and so you go to 10 out of 36, which the case we won under Section 5 before that Shelby County decision, the court decried that was clearly retrogression and an inappropriate map. So we engaged the state, and we had challenged that 2011 map. We won, but then we got reversed by the Supreme Court. And during that time period, the state did negotiation with actually MALDEF, and they came up with 1 more seat. And that seat was the seat that was in Dallas-Fort Worth. Because Dallas-Fort Worth, you lost white population. And it was the fastest growing area in the state. You lost white population, and all the population was basically brown and black. So you would have thought that, of course, if you're going to give a new seat in Dallas and Fort Worth, you're going to give it to an African American or a Latino, primarily a Latino. So we drew up districts, and we had a Latino district, and we had an African American district that would come out of that area. But that didn't. What the state did was they just basically created another Anglo seat in that area, and so they ended up with clear retrogression in terms of the number of seats statewide. So I just want to talk briefly about how they do it, because I guess my time's probably up. What do we mean by discrimination in voting or gerrymandering? What the state map drawers do is they look at minority communities, and with great precision they know how to go in and do incredible things. What Dr. Murray testified was that the Dallas-Fort Worth gerrymander was the most egregious in the country, because what they did, you would have pockets of the black and brown community. They cut it in the middle, put one in one district, one in the other district, and instead of having districts wholly contained within a county, they would simply splice, for the most part, and take little pieces, run dog legs out through East Texas in areas that were hostile to minority voters. And so by doing that, you, with all that population, Dallas and Fort Worth, you had one minority district, CD 30, with Congresswoman Etta Bernice Johnson. And what we were able to do in litigation is we did what was called a shading to the court. And you can do shading that shows all precincts that are 80% or more minority. And so we took her CD 30, and there was one speck in the middle, one white speck, but every other precinct was 80% black or brown. They just went and cut precincts and said, well, you got blacks here, so they split precincts in the middle. Well, we're going to take the blacks out here and put them over here. We'll cut the whites out, let them be over in this other district. So they split many precincts. So what the court said is they did what's called packing and cracking to her district, and they also held that there were other splits in that community that made it a clear racial gerrymander up in Dallas-Fort Worth, but particularly CD 30 was just a great example of looking at how it has occurred. So I think that what we need to do nowadays is to be able to document. I just want to briefly comment on those three requirements. We've got to show racially polarized voting. So you've got to show that candidates that are preferred by the African American community are not elected, the Latino community are not elected in the communities that they're in, that whites vote one way and they vote another way. And you've got to show insensitivity to minority interests, and you've got to show the history of discrimination in the area. And so one of the things that we do, we like to have hearings. We like to have an 800 hotline during election day, so you can try to get documentation. One of the things we did that was really very unique, because the guys who are redistricting lawyers didn't do this, and they know a lot more redistricting than I do, but we went and did it kind of the old-fashioned way. We found examples of just total racism, with putting candidates in the flag, standing in front of the Mexican flag and the Chinese flag to try to show, to get some racial antagonism, darkening the skin of white candidates who happen to be Democratic candidates, putting gaps in their teeth, saying they're supporting welfare queens and putting Cadillacs and Lincolns behind them, having yard signs with white cowboys kicking President Obama in the butt. So we had all that kind of evidence to show this stuff is still going on and all these problems occurred. And what we did in 2017, we talked a lot about President Trump, because President Trump in the rural areas and suburban areas in the state in the rural areas got higher votes than any presidential candidate in history, and he ran such a racist campaign. And we talked about Judge Curiel and how he had the audacity to say just because a man was of Latino heritage, he couldn't handle a particular case. And we were able to show how the Texas politicians, members of the Texas delegations, didn't say anything. They did nothing. So that shows that minority concerns were of no interest to the people in this state. And And so I would urge you to try to identify, try to document if something happens, because you need to be able to have those things and put those things on as evidence when you get to a witness stand or when you get a case that's actually filed, so you'll have the type evidence that you need to show that there's continued racially polarized voting. So you do need folks to run as well. Need folks to run and show that there's maybe some disadvantage. I know that what occurred here in Harris County a few years ago, one of the pieces of evidence we put on was like there was a Democratic slate, and all the Democratic candidates won except there were 4, and they were all minorities or one white female who had a minority-sounding name. Her name was like a Shaniqua or something. I forget exactly what it was. But Congressman Green talked about that. I put him on the witness stand, and he talked about that, and it was pretty obvious. And so in the news reports after that, her husband was really upset, and they went and had her name officially changed so she could run for judge again. So that really just shows the kind of significance that we have in the voting system. But I think those are the things we really need to look at and understand, that there is incredible dishonesty, so we've got to have a great record. We have to be concerned about the Supreme Court, because there's every reason to believe that there's going to be a change in the Supreme Court that's going to be upcoming, and that's going to mean all the difference in the world, because right now Justice Kennedy is the only thing that stands between us and the abyss, although in the latest case in Cooper, Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion that was on our side. It was kind of interesting, and so we need to look at that and interpret that more, and I'm looking at that right now to thinking that he likes to see minorities cooperate with Anglos, and so it was these districts were under 50% and did require some kind of cooperation, and he had supported Section 5 opinions on that basis before. So that might be something that he's looking at, but we need to kind of understand that, see if there's any way to get his vote on something. I was surprised at that, but glad to see it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bledsoe. Now I would like to bring up Mr. Giannis Banks to the podium.
All right, good morning. My name is Giannis Banks. I work with, as you heard from my bio, Capital Metro. But before that, I worked for the Texas and NAACP. And through the instructions of Gary, I learned how to draw redistricting maps. First time doing it, first time dealing with redistricting. Gary said, go learn, have fun. It was a fun experience of just trying to learn. It's a very complicated but easy problem or process. It blows my mind that this used to be done by paper and hand and pencil, because it's just, they taught me how to do it. I did one district, I think one county like that, and said no. Thank God for computers. And so just some general requirements that you've heard from what's being said so far. And I don't know if Gary mentioned as well, though, but so Texas, as part of the redistricting lawsuit, our case is now back again before the Supreme Court. And so I guess at some point this cycle, the courts will be looking at that, and then that could impact our November elections, maybe, depending on how they rule. So, you know, it's never a boring time in Texas when it comes to voting. So general requirements. Districts of a given type, Senate, House, Congressional, State Board of Education, must have equal or nearly equal populations. And we've talked about that through the census process. Districts must be drawn in a manner that neither has the purpose nor will have the effect of denying or abridging the right to vote on the basis of color, race, or language group. These requirements are based on the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the 15th Amendment, the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, and for congressional districts, Section 2, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. If you ever go to any redistricting lawsuit case because you're bored and you just want to see what's happening, you will hear a lot of these thrown out of this is violating this amendment, 4th Amendment, 15th Amendment. And so if you ever wonder why, that's why. So there's many avenues during the case that they can argue. So Texas, you'll hear a lot talk about white versus register. It came from Texas. It set the basic standard of deviation for the maximum acceptable population deviation for state legislative districts. Sounds like a lot, but just remember that when it comes to your state leg districts, you have a plus or minus 10% variance of the district population size. As long as you're within that range, you'll be okay. It can be over, it can be under. You don't want to go anything above 10%. You go above 10%, your district is not a good district. So you want to keep it in that range, and that's just to try to help balance out when it comes to state ledge. There is one caveat, or kind of caveat to that for the districts, and this is because of the Texas Constitution. So we have different rules in Texas we do have to kind of follow. There's the national rules, we have to follow the federal, which you have the Voting Rights Act and things of that nature, but we also have the Texas Constitution. And that is in Section 26, Article 3, dealing with county line. And that can sometimes become a headache when you're drawing these maps. If you have districts such as Harris County, Dallas County, Tarrant County, Travis County, your large districts, if you can create these large counties, I should say, I'm sorry. If you can create districts wholly into these counties, they have to be all self-contained. If you ever look at a map, you see Harris County, none of Harris County state legislators, their state seats go outside of Harris County. That's because of the county line rule in the Texas Constitution. And it even says it to the point of even if you do your county population, you divide the number by your set size of what your districts is supposed to be. And even if you can create, say, 24, because Harris County, there was an argument in so many cases. 2011, there was an argument during the session about how many districts should be in Harris County. Should it be 24? Should it be 25? Because you had some leftover numbers. And I think it ended up becoming 24, and the courts agreed it should have been 24. So Harris County actually lost a seat, and that's what that argument was, that they didn't want to lose a seat. Of course, that's power, money, control, what have you. But what you're supposed to do is, if you have these county districts and you divide it by the number, it'll say you're supposed to have 24 point some odd districts. And then you look at what that number is and say, well, we may have to round it up and create a whole 25th district, or our districts may have to be a little bit bigger than the average, than the norm, but it has to be all contained within that county if your county is big enough. Harris, Tarrant, Travis, Bear, and I think El Paso falls into that area too as well. Now, for those counties that are not of that size, but you can have some districts in there, they want you to do as much as possible, keep it within that county as much as possible, and if it spills out, it has to spill out. Think Bell County. I think one of the arguments you will see in the maps that they've done in the case is that there should have been a district wholly contained in Bell County. That was our argument. The state didn't really want to do that because that would create a minority opportunity district, and they were trying to limit the voices of minorities. Our argument was, no, Killeen and Bell County, you can pretty much create a self-contained district. But the county line rule is something that you always have to keep in mind if you're drawing state legislative maps, because that's a surefire way to get your map dinged if you're not respecting that rule. The ideal district population is the population district would have if all districts in the plan have equal populations. We just talked about that. And of course, you have a strict one person, one vote standard. That applies to congressional districts. If you remember, if you didn't hear, I guess it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, it's all blurring together. There was a lawsuit that was brought together in Texas trying to do away or trying to fix that. They were concerned about the Hispanic population and saying, well, because they're undocumented citizens here, what have you, that's including the census, the one person, one vote rule doesn't really work. Went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court struck it down for obvious reasons. But when it comes to your congressional districts, there's no standard of deviation room. It has to be equal for the most part. The courts will let you give you some flexibility because of population, how big Texas is. It could be kind of hard to find that one person or 5 people that will make that district completely zeroed out when you're drawing your districts for your congressional. But for the most part, your congressional districts need to be exact. If you get away from that exact point, it needs to be like maybe 1 or 2. Don't push it. And sometimes that can be tedious because you then will have to click on each little, get as low as you can on your map software that you're using. It can get very exact about how many people are living in a district. And then you have to just start moving things around, right? So if this district, your congressional district in Bexar County isn't exactly zeroed out when you look at the deviation on your map, mapping software, you have to start moving around, and you may have to move around your districts throughout the whole state so you can get them all zeroed out or as close as possible, like no more than one. So it can become very tedious when you feel like you're doing good and you're finally done and you see 10. And it's like, oh God, okay, now I need to find how can I move around 10 people and spread them around and make sure that I come zeroed out, because it's very important to have that one person, one vote when it comes to congressional districts. Now, how do you draw maps? One of the things I thought about when I first started is, how am I supposed to do this? Is there a rule? Do I just do it? Am I supposed to start from a certain spot? There's different ways. I think it just depends on how you feel and who you are. You can start with the original map that you have that's already drawn. As you heard, we picked up 4 seats, congressional seats last time, and this time there's rumors we may pick up 2 to 3 congressional seats, what it's looking like. So you could start from the old map and see where the population growth is and try to move some stuff around and see if you can't create 4 districts or 3 districts, and everything is good. And sometimes that might be more of a headache than what it's worth, trying to take stuff away and move stuff to create a district. It could become a headache. So you could start from scratch. Then the question becomes, well, okay, if you start from scratch, where do you want to start? Do I want to start in South Texas? Do I want to start in Central Texas? Do I want to start in East Texas, West Texas, North Texas? Do I want to start where I live because I know there? It's up to you. Do what you feel. Just know that wherever you start, which is why maps can look so differently. It's because of where people can start and what you're working on, right? And so your map can look completely different from your friend sitting beside you because you started in different places, or your goal or intent may have been different. But like you said, it can be done. You have your different things you can look to. It can be done where there are minority populations because of the VRA. You got to keep in mind all the different rules you have to follow depending on what you're doing. County line rule, if you're doing legislature. Of course, there's the Voting Rights Act that even though we don't have Section 5, we still have Section 2. So you want to make sure that you're not impacting these minority districts in any way. And then that definition, of course, is left up to the courts and people to decide, did you retrogress this district or this district improve? How badly did you hurt it? It's kind of a judgment call, right? So if it went from 45% African American to 44% African American, did it decline? Yes. Is it harmful? It depends who you ask. For some folks, yeah, you are hurting this district and your goal is to eventually wither it away, and it's just what it is. So it's something you have to keep in mind. Once again, like we said, you can start from different sections of the state or the county or the city or whatever you're drawing, school district, whatever you're drawing, or once again, you can use currently drawn districts. Your districts have to be contiguous. As you ever looked at a district, you see there's no holes in it. If you're in District 5, it's one big shape, right? There's that one big shape, and in the middle of that shape, there's District 4 that's there, and then District 4 is over here. It all has to be connected. You can't, and there's different rules when it comes to body of water, because of course, if you have a river through it or a lake, and that can kind of be discontinuous, but I think they look at it as if there's a bridge or something that's connecting that, you're okay. But you want to make sure your districts are contiguous, and compact. I think you've heard folks talk about that already, but that's just making sure your district is not one long strip all across from East Texas to West Texas. That's not a very compact district. You want to make sure your districts are compact. Mapping software now has numbers that they use can show you the compactness of your district that you're drawing. If it goes to court, of course, they will ask you what's your compactness percentage, what's the number, and they'll look at that. But before software is also one of those things of you eyeball test, right? You look at it. There's other data and other tests that can be done on it, and there's no one better than the other. It's just kind of personal preference if you're looking at it by eye or some other data. But what you really want to look for is that it's a fairly regular shape. Okay, if you have something in the shape of a U, that's not a compact district, just because of the shape that it is, right? Yeah, there's not going to be, if it's kind of circular, that's fairly compact. If it's kind of square shaped, that's fairly compact. Of course, most districts are not circle or square. They're kind of different shape, but you want to make sure that they're as tight as possible and that you're not reaching. So you're not going from West Harris County over to East Harris County to create a district. You want to try to keep it in that area combined, because that's another way to get your map ignored or your district struck down, because it's not compact. And once again, the computer can help you with that and telling you how compact it is. So if you have doubts or you have concern, Thank God for software and technology, because we're able to see, okay, yeah, this isn't as compact as this district. Now, a continuation of how to draw maps. Yeah, you want to keep your political subdivisions together as much as possible, as well as communities of interest, which you heard President Bledsoe talk about the communities of interest, what those are, but as well as counties, city, wards, and voting precincts. Once again, this just depends on what you're drawing. If you're drawing state rep districts, you want to look at your voting precincts in cities, especially if you're going outside of the county, right? They don't like, when it comes to the courts, they don't like to see cities split. So if you split half of Houston, or you look at, where's my friend from? Missouri City. You don't want to split Missouri City half here with this rep, half here for this rep, if possible. They want you to keep these cities together. And then once you get into cities and you're drawing like city council districts, they want to make sure you keep voting precincts or wards together. So the map can pull up the voting precincts on there for you, so you can look at what these precincts are, and they will look to see, are you splitting precincts? Now, because you gain numbers, there's going to be times where precincts have to be split. It's just the nature of the beast. But you want to do it as little as possible. And that's something that when you're in court and your map is being compared to somebody else's, that's something people will point out. Well, yeah, you did this map and you split 15 precincts, voting precincts. My map only split 5. My map is better than your map because I didn't split as many precincts as you did. And then, of course, it's all about how you draw it, and you can make your argument. But that's something you want to make sure you keep an eye on. It's a lot to keep an eye on when you're drawing maps. It's not as simple as some people think of. Why can't we just do this, that, and the third? Because it gets complicated and very complex. And so, yeah, you don't want to split your wards, your voting precincts, your cities, your counties. And then mapping software, once again, can help you with that. Technology is a wonderful thing when we use it right. So you want to keep them together because the courts will, and the judges will ask about that. Why are you splitting this precinct? Well, Your Honor, in order to draw these districts like this had to be split. We looked, we tried to. It couldn't be avoided. We didn't want to. And even in some maps, I think in this last go-around of redistricting, the courts that came back and told us, the district courts of San Antonio came back, and the instructions they gave us when drawing the state ledge maps was to keep the cities together as much as possible, because some of the other maps, they were split. So we re-looked at it and see, okay, so where can we keep these cities together where we may have messed up in the map we sent before? Okay, there's a city up, and we looked at, I think one of the counties we worked on was Dallas County. So we looked at the counties, the cities in Dallas County that we may have split, because I didn't go down that deep dive and zoom in and see, okay, this is all of one city. Let's make sure the city stays here, or is it here? We split this one up. Let's see if we can put this whole. We can put this whole. Map is still functional. It's still working. Everybody's happy. So this is something to always keep in mind, is not to split these divisions as much as possible. But once again, there are times where it just has to be done. And, you know, just document why it had to be done and give your explanation. And if need be in court, that's what you would tell them, and be prepared for that. Some examples of gerrymandering. I think this is one you've seen in textbooks for years now. The OG, the original gerrymanderer, right? Of what it looked like. You can see how it's snaking all across the county to make this district when it's not necessary. And you heard President Bledsoe talk about how it reaches in and have things reaching in. That's one of them. And that's the old one, and folks may think, well, that's a long time ago, it still doesn't happen. This was Congressional District 12 in North Carolina. And this is, I believe, from 2006, might be from 02. It's no longer there. They've redrawn it, but once again, this was packing, as you heard President Bledsoe talk about, and that's when you take a group of, say, African Americans, and you pack them all in one district, where you probably could have drawn 2 or 3 districts because of the population, but you packed them all together, so you're weakening that voice. And here you can see, I'm from North Carolina, and you can see how it goes from basically the top of North Carolina all the way down to towards the bottom in Charlotte. They could have drawn multiple districts, but they packed them all in to kind of weaken that voice where they could have multiple representations. Oddly enough, Mississippi does a great job of maximizing their vote. When you look at the population, especially for African Americans there in Mississippi, they do a great job on the state legislative level of making sure they have their votes maximized, their voices maximized when it comes to state representation. I make fun of Mississippi for a lot of things, but I give them credit for that. And here's Illinois. Here's another example. This is from 2004. This is one district. If you can look, right here is where that district is connected. This is 294. They worked the highway to keep this district connected, and this is two high Latino areas. And so what they did, instead of having, and if you look at it, if you take away this, the population along this highway cannot be that much, right? I don't know Illinois is like that, but I can fairly assume that's not a lot of people living along 294, because people don't live along interstates like that. But they connected that little slither to put these two Latino districts together, and so instead of creating two Hispanic districts, they create one. And so this is another example of packing, where they packed them all in because they didn't want them to have a voice. This was done in 2004. I think it's gone now, I believe. But here's another example, and we can talk about U-shape or unicorn of how this is not a good district. Nothing about that says it's a good district, but they tried it and did it for a while. And this is something you have to also keep an eye for when you're looking at maps that other people are doing. Do they have weird districts like this? Because there may be times where if you draw on your map and you have to defend your map or why your map is better than somebody else's, you can easily highlight something like that. Like, this just makes no sense. But they tried it. Once again, they worked the highway to connect that. It's a little small slither. You can't see it too well, but it's there. It's in green. They tried it. And that's the end of my presentation. If you have questions, we can talk about it. Like I said, I've been drawing maps for a while now, and the best way to learn and the best way to do it is just to do it. People can tell you how you should do it, but until you go and practice, you will never get to do it. And the other thing I would say, if you have great relationship with your legislator, when it comes to drawing statewide maps, state maps, get to know your legislator, because they will have the state software as Red Apple. And they can all have it in their district office. Of course, if you're in Austin, you can go to their capital office if you have that relationship and they let you use it. But you can also draw on their district office. So even now, during the interim, before we get to 2020, and they do the census in 2021 when they do redistricting, if you have a good relationship with them, you may be able to ask them, hey, could you put this software on your district office and I can come in and practice and play with this for getting prepared for this next coming session of redistricting and learn how to draw some maps. And just try it out. Once again, the best way to do it is just to do it. There's no right or wrong. There's no classes that you can take to learn. It's just doing it, and that's the best way. That's what I did. So,
What's the name of that software?
so for the legislature, Red Apple, and it's the proprietary software. It's for the state of Texas. Nobody else can get that. There's like Maptitude and other software that the public can buy or people can buy and use, but the state created, and it's like REDAPPL. Is how it's spelled, or APL, but it's their software that they have and it's proprietary. Yeah.
Comment: the Texas Legislative Council gave a presentation recently at a gerrymandering conference, and they did operate public kiosks. They just weren't well advertised. So
Well, their public kiosks are in Austin, though. That's the problem. During the session, you have to go up to them. Right. They only use them when redistricting is happening, and you have to go up to Austin to use them. But if you're not in Austin, any legislator can have it on their office. And they have Maptitude here at